Good morning, everyone. It is October 22nd. Going to talk about what's going on in Israel. The casualty totals for the Israelis now is 1,400 dead with 5,400 injured. The Hamas-run Palestinian Health Ministry claims that 4,600 Palestinians have died, but that includes the now debunked 500 dead from the hospital strike that I talked about a couple of videos ago. There have been 24 Hezbollah fighters that have died near the Lebanese-Israeli border. Now, I want to address some falsehoods that have come out specifically with regard to U.S. involvement, China, etc. The first thing is this concern over these warships, these Chinese warships that have entered the region, so to speak. Well, this is not entirely the whole story. These warships are on a rotational deployment from China to the region to counter piracy, specifically piracy out of Somalia. The 6 ships that deployed were to replace those that were conducting operations. These ships have been in the region since May of this year, well before the war started, and they are rotating in and out with various stops for partnership visits. They're in Kuwait. They just conducted a planned joint exercise with Oman. Chinese ships will be conducting more of these operations in the region as the U.S. has recently decreased its anti-piracy footprint in the region. The U.K. and France have deployed ships there too to counter piracy and secure their shipping. This is nothing new, and it's not meant to be seen as Chinese countering the U.S. when it comes to carrier groups outside of Israel. These ships have been used for evacuation purposes as well in the Middle East, such as in Yemen in 2015, so this isn't anything new. It's nothing to be overly concerned about. The second thing I want to address, and this is caught on like wildfire on social media, is the idea that something bad or ominous is taking place because the USS Gerald R. Ford is feeding their sailors surf and turf or steak and lobster, and that supposedly means something. Well, often this is people watching too many movies, thinking that, oh, we receive a good meal before going to war. Others say that it's because there might be extended and they get a good meal, quote unquote, to break the news of an extension. Well, the reality is most carrier deployments last 5 to 9 months. The Gerald R. Ford left port 5 months ago, so it's not due for an extension right now. What really is happening is these ships are on a 21-day standard menu cycle. That this 3-week menu has various items, and they go through them every 3 weeks. It usually goes something like there's an Asian meal, there's a Mexican meal, they have some sort of American like cheeseburger corn dog meal, they have an Italian meal, maybe pizza, maybe wings, and then usually on like either Saturday or Sunday there is steak and lobster. It's surf and turf night. This menu changes based on what's available, what's about to expire during the course of a float or deployment or being underway. The USS Gerald R. Ford having steak and lobster is meaningless. Other than it was probably scheduled on a 3-week menu, and yesterday was just when that was scheduled to happen. This menu was likely planned well before this war broke out. So when people see, oh, they're having steak and lobster, that's in my mind a good meal, and I watched an XYZ naval movie back in the day, and now I'm equating it that we're going to war, that's silly. When I was in Iraq, we had surf and turf like every week. It got old. It's not something that is what we think is signifying that these sailors are getting good meals in case it's like their last meal. That's not how it works. And apparently this caught on like wildfire on social media, but I'm not surprised. Now, the White House has asked Congress for $100 billion in emergency national security funding, which includes $61.4 billion for Ukraine, $14.3 billion for Israel, $14.45 billion for the southern border, $2 billion for the Indo-Pacific, and $10 billion for humanitarian aid that kind of lumps into all of those: Israel, Gaza, Ukraine, the southern border, as well as some Indo-Pacific partners. The U.S. State Department has begun to evacuate any non-essential personnel and their families from the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, Iraq, following a recent increase in attacks on American troops and nationals in the Middle East. That being said, U.S. Central Command has announced that a recent notification that was sent out to various media outlets stating a number of American service members were killed by a strike on Al Assad Air Base, which is in western Iraq, was completely false. That actually didn't happen. U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin stated during an interview this morning that we are seeing the prospect of a significant escalation of attacks against our troops and people across the Middle East, and we will not hesitate to respond if the conflict in the region continues to expand. The United States will send a Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, or also known as THAAD system, which is an air defense system for countering missiles and things like that, as well as additional Patriot battalions to various locations throughout the Middle East. And those are going to be used to protect U.S. assets as well as allies. Now, looking at the map, we have Gaza Strip here. The U.S. government has pressed Israel to delay its imminent invasion of Gaza to allow for the release of more Hamas-held hostages, as well as get aid into Gaza. 2 Americans held by Hamas have been freed, but there are still 212 hostages held by the terrorist organization. Israel responded to the request from the U.S. by informing the U.S. that it will not wait long before it begins its ground operation. Several different Palestinian militias attacked Israel with indirect fire, including Hamas's Al-Qassam brigades, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, as well as the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, all of which conducted mortar strikes across Israel, which is kind of highlighting a problem for Israel as they don't face a singular enemy in the form of just Hamas, but now find themselves confronting a coalition of Palestinian militias, many of which do not wear uniforms and tend to use civilians as shields, making it difficult for Israel to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants on the battlefield. Since October 7th, these militias together have fired over 6,900 rockets into Israel from Gaza Strip. Incidentally, of those 6,900, almost a quarter of them failed to reach Israeli territory and instead crashed into Gaza Strip itself. Meanwhile, Israeli warplanes continue to attack targets in Gaza Strip, and the Israeli military announced its plans to intensify airstrikes over the next coming days. It's worth noting an incident that took place on the border with Egypt between Gaza Strip and Egypt at the Rafah border crossing. An Israeli tank accidentally shot an Egyptian outpost near Rafah. No one was hurt. The incident is being investigated. It took place right around here, and Israel has issued an apology and expressed regret for the incident. Now, speaking of the Rafah crossing on the Egyptian border, it was briefly reopened Saturday to allow a 20-truck convoy of humanitarian aid to enter. This was the first delivery of aid to Gaza since the war broke out. A bit later, 17 trucks also entered Gaza, but Hamas has said the aid coming into Gaza is not enough. Well, all I can say is don't start a war you can't win, and then you won't have to worry about aid coming from other countries. Moving to the West Bank, while actual violent clashes in the region have steadily increased, there was a notable drop in anti-Israeli protests. On October 21st, there was only 3 protests recorded, which is a big contrast from what took place the day prior, where 12 protests took place. This calm might be short-lived, though, because Hamas has issued a call for global protests in solidarity with Gaza, set for October 22nd. They seem to issue these calls every weekend, but this could potentially ignite further civil unrest in the West Bank. Israeli authorities have arrested dozens across the West Bank and conducted airstrikes up in Jenin, which is up in this northern portion up here. Moving up to the Golan Heights and the Israeli-Lebanese border, it appears that this situation is becoming increasingly precarious, with both Israel and Hezbollah in the region signaling the potential for amplified confrontations in the near future. This is in anticipation of the Israeli Defense Force opting for their ground movements into Gaza Strip. There have been an increase in attacks, 11 attacks involving ATGMs, which is anti-tank guided missiles, as well as indirect fire have taken place. Israel has responded with airstrikes and artillery of their own, but this is currently what looks to be the hot spot until a potential Gaza invasion by Israel is executed.